She had been rejected, humiliated, and forgotten by her own pack. And on the worst day of her life, when the Alpha forced her to kneel in front of everyone she'd ever known, the most powerful man in the world walked through those doors. And he didn't look at the Alpha, he looked at her. This is the story of a girl who was told she was nothing, and the king who knew better. The cold came before the light did. Mara had learned a long time ago to be dressed and moving before the sun touched the horizon. Not because anyone asked her to, not because there was reward in it, but because the hours before dawn were the only ones that belonged to her. The only stretch of time when the pack hall was empty enough that she could breathe without feeling someone's eyes slide over her, like she was something stuck to the bottom of a boot. She pulled her worn linen shirt over her head and caught a glimpse of her reflection in the small, cracked mirror propped against the wall. Her eyes moved, as they always did, to the mark on the left side of her neck. Faded, broken at the edges. The kind of mate mark that happened when a bond was rejected so completely it couldn't even scar properly. It just sat there, pale and unfinished, like a sentence that had been stopped mid-word. She looked away and tied her hair back. The pack kitchen was hers for exactly 1 hour before the others woke. She hauled water, stoked the fire, and began the work of preparing a morning meal for 60 wolves who would not thank her for it. Her hands moved through the motions with the efficiency of someone who had stopped expecting anything different. Chop, stir, carry, repeat. Then the steam rose and the fire crackled, and for a little while the world was almost quiet. Then the hall began to fill. They came in loud and warm and settled into their usual seats with the ease of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged. Mara moved between the tables, setting down bowls, refilling pitchers. No one looked at her directly. They had a way of speaking around her, over her, through her, as though she were a piece of furniture that had learned to walk. She set a bowl in front of Cade, one of Damon's enforcers, and his elbow caught it on the way down. The stew hit the table and splashed across her sleeve. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look up. Again? The woman beside him laughed into her cup. The Omega's going to waste half our breakfast before the morning's done. Mara picked up the bowl, but wiped the table and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had tried once, a long time ago, had straightened her spine and met someone's eyes and spoken her own name like it meant something. The memory of what came after still lived in her ribs. She had learned to be invisible instead. It was not a perfect life, but it was a survivable one. By mid-morning she was in the eastern yard, splitting wood. Her shoulders burned, but she kept a steady rhythm. The repetition of it was something close to comfort. She was nearly through the pile when she heard footsteps crunch on the gravel behind her and felt the particular shift in the air that meant she was about to become someone's entertainment. "Look at that," said a voice she recognized without turning. Liesel. 17, wolf-shifted twice already, and deeply committed to the sport of cruelty. The Omega doing enforcer work. Cute. A few others laughed. Mara set the axe down, stacked the wood she'd split, and walked back toward the hall without responding. She heard Liesel say something else, sharper this time, but the words blurred into the general noise of a world that had decided she wasn't worth listening to. She had become very good at that particular kind of deafness. She ate her own meals alone, always. In the small alcove off the back of the kitchen where the light was poor and no one had reason to come. A heel of bread, whatever was left in the pot. She ate standing, because sitting felt too much like settling in, and she had never let herself fully settle. Settling meant accepting, and some stubborn, unkillable part of her refused to accept that this was all there was. Her mother used to say that. Don't accept the room they give you. You were made for open sky. She'd said it like she knew something, like there was a secret sitting just beneath the words. But her mother was gone before Mara could ask what she meant. Fever, 3 winters ago, quiet and sudden. And her father had disappeared from the pack years before that, driven out in disgrace over something no one would fully explain to her. What she knew was that he had gone, and he had not come back, and she had stopped waiting. She had no one. That was the simple truth of it. No blood to stand beside her, no packmate who claimed her, no mate whose bond would have given her even borrowed status. She stayed because the wild was no place for a lone wolf, and she had no coin and no contacts and nowhere in the known territory that would take her in without a pack letter. She stayed because survival, even a miserable one, was still survival. She was washing dishes in the evening when the bell rang. 3 pulls, slow and deliberate, pack gathering. The sound moved through her stomach like ice water. Mara set down the pot she was holding and stood very still for a moment, listening to the sudden movement of the pack around her. Boots on stone, voices dropping to murmurs, the particular tension that filled the air whenever Damon decided it was time to remind everyone who held the power here. She dried her hands. Damon didn't call gatherings for good news. He called them when he wanted an audience. When he wanted someone to bleed quietly in front of the whole pack so everyone else would remember to stay in line. She had attended enough of them to know exactly how they worked. She had never once been the one standing in the center. Something told her, moving through the dark corridor toward the great hall, that tonight would be different. 2 days before the bell rang, Mara was in the woods. She went every few days when her supply of dried herbs ran low, the pack's unofficial healer by default, not by title, because titles implied value, and no one was handing her those. She had taught herself from her mother's old notes, a thin journal with a cracked spine that she kept wrapped in cloth beneath her sleeping mat. Yarrow for wounds, elderflower for fever, blackroot for pain that had gone on too long. Bet she knew the forest floor the way she knew the kitchen, by necessity, by repetition, by the quiet dignity of being useful even when no one said thank you. She had gone farther east than usual that morning, following a patch of valerian she'd spotted the week before, when she heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of one, the way the birds stopped, the way the undergrowth went still in that particular manner that meant something large and suffering was very close. She found him just past the second ridge, collapsed at the base of a wide oak with his back against the bark and one hand pressed to his side. He was in human form, which meant he'd burned through whatever energy the shift required and had nothing left. The wound at his ribs was deep, claws, not a blade, and it had been bleeding long enough that the leaves beneath him were dark with it. A rogue. Mara saw the mark first, or rather, the absence of one, the smooth, unmarked skin at his throat where a pack sigil would have been. Her chest tightened. Pack law was not complicated on this point. Rogues were to be reported immediately. They were not to be aided, sheltered, or spoken to. They were to be left for the enforcers or left to the wild, which amounted to the same ending by different routes. She took one step back. Then he opened his eyes. He was young. That was the thing that stopped her feet and held them. Younger than she'd expected, barely older than her, maybe 19, with dark circles deep enough to suggest he hadn't slept in days, and an expression that was not threatening or feral but simply, completely, terrified. The kind of terror that lives in someone who has already lost everything and is now watching the last door close. She knew that look. She had worn it herself in smaller ways, every day, for years. She looked back through the trees toward the pack border. Then she looked at him again. "Can you walk?" she asked. He shook his head. She made her decision in the space between one breath and the next. Not with grand certainty, not with any sense that she was being brave, but with the quiet resignation of someone who has decided that there are things she cannot walk away from without losing the last piece of herself that still matters. She tucked her herb basket against her hip and crouched beside him. "Then we'll have to be slow about it," she said. She got him to the old groundskeeper's shelter at the edge of the eastern woods, abandoned for 2 seasons, far enough from the main trail that no one had reason to go there. It took the better part of an hour and cost her a bruised shoulder and both of her spare bandages. She cleaned the wound with what she had, packed it with yarrow paste, and told him to stay still and stay silent. He did both. Over the next 2 nights she came back. She brought broth she'd skimmed from the kitchen pot in a flask tucked under her coat, more bandages, a salve for the fever that spiked on the second night and had her genuinely frightened for several hours. She sat beside him in the dark and monitored his breathing and did not let herself think too carefully about what would happen if anyone found out. In the quiet hours he talked and she listened. His name was Eli. He'd belonged to a mid-territory pack 3 days east until his alpha had ordered him to track and execute a family of humans who had witnessed a shift. He had refused. He told it plainly, without drama, just a man explaining a choice he'd made knowing the cost. They'd driven him out that same night with nothing but the clothes on his back and a wound to remember them by. Mara listened and did not say much. She didn't need to. She recognized the shape of his story, the moment you did the right thing and the world punished you for it. She had smaller versions of that same story written all over her life. On the third morning, his color had returned and his hands were steady. He stood without help, which felt like a small miracle. And they walked together to the far edge of the shelter where the trees thinned toward open territory. She gave him the remaining salve and the last of the bandages and a rough direction toward a settlement she'd heard took in lone wolves without asking for papers. He gripped her hand before he left, both of his around hers, with a firmness that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "You are not what they say you are." His voice was quiet and certain, the way people speak when they mean something completely. "Whatever they've told you, it's wrong. I want you to know that." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she trusted her voice. She watched him disappear into the trees and stood there for a moment in the early light before turning back toward the pack. She didn't see the figure at the tree line behind her. She didn't see him watch her go, then turn and move quickly in the direction of the main hall. But someone had been there, and by nightfall, Damon knew everything. The great hall smelled of pine resin and tallow candles, and the particular kind of collective tension that fills a room when 60 people know something is about to happen and not one of them intends to stop it. Mara stood near the back wall when she arrived, which was where she always stood at gatherings, close enough to the door that she could feel the draft from the gap beneath it, far enough from the center that she might go unnoticed. She had spent years perfecting the art of taking up as little space as possible. Shoulders in, eyes down, breathe shallow, become part of the wall. Tonight the wall offered her nothing, but Damon was already at the front of the hall when she entered. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the kind of physical authority that packs mistook for leadership because they had never been given a reason to know the difference. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the room fill with the patient, satisfied expression of someone who had already decided how the evening would end. His eyes found her the moment she crossed the threshold. She felt it like a hand around her throat. He let the silence build first. That was his way. He understood that anticipation did half the work for him, that 60 wolves holding their breath were already compliant before he'd said a single word. He walked the length of the front slowly, letting his footsteps fill the quiet, and then he stopped and turned and began. And he spoke about pack law, about the sanctity of borders, about the trust required to hold a community together, and what happened when that trust was broken by weakness, by sentiment, by the kind of soft foolishness that had no place among wolves who understood what survival actually cost. He was measured and calm, and every word landed with the weight of someone who knew the room was already his. Then he said her name, Mara. Just the one word. But the way he said it, flat, deliberate, like something being set down on a table before it was examined, made every head in the hall turn. She felt the shift as though it were physical, 60 pairs of eyes. She had wanted to be invisible, and now she was the only thing anyone was looking at. "Come forward." Her feet moved before her mind fully agreed to it. Yet the crowd parted without being asked. Not out of respect, but the way people move away from something they don't want to be associated with. She walked to the center of the hall and stopped and stood and tried to remember how to hold herself upright. Damon circled her once. Slowly. The way predators move when they already know the outcome. He told the pack what she had done. He made it thorough. The rogue, the shelter, the 2 nights, the supplies taken from the pack's kitchen. He used the word betrayal 4 times. He used the phrase omega instincts like it was a diagnosis, like her capacity for compassion was a defect she'd been born with and inflicted on everyone around her. He described Eli as dangerous, feral, a threat she had naively welcomed onto their territory. And he described Mara as the kind of weak link that got packs killed. Some of the wolves shifted in discomfort. She noticed that. She also noticed that not one of them spoke. She searched the faces without meaning to, some old habit of hope she hadn't quite managed to kill. Penna, who she had once helped through a difficult fever and who now studied the floor with great focus. Old Garrett, who she'd sat beside at enough meals to call familiar, who was looking at a point somewhere above her head. Liesel and her friends in the back, wearing small curved smiles like this was something they'd been promised. No one met her eyes. Damon stopped circling. He stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the satisfaction in his face. Not anger, she realized. He wasn't angry. This was enjoyment. "You will kneel," he said, loud enough for every corner of the hall to catch it. "And you will beg this pack's forgiveness for what you've done. Or you will leave tonight with nothing. No coin, no letter, no pack sanction. You'll take your Omega sentimentality into the wild and see how far it gets you." The hall was absolutely silent. Mara's legs were shaking. She could feel it from the knee down, a fine, continuous tremor she had no power to stop. Her vision had gone strange at the edges, the candlelight smearing slightly, and she understood distantly that her eyes were filling and that she was losing the battle to keep them from spilling over. She thought of her mother, of the journal with the cracked spine, of a voice saying you were made for open sky, like it was prophecy, and not just the desperate comfort of a woman watching her daughter learn to disappear. Yes, she thought of Eli's hands around hers, the certainty in his voice. "You are not what they say you are." She looked at the floor. She began to lower herself, one knee bending, her body folding despite everything her chest was screaming, because she had nowhere to go and nothing to fight with, and the wild was a death sentence, and she was so tired, she was so unspeakably tired. The doors of the great hall exploded open, not swung, not pushed, exploded. Both panels slamming back against the stone walls with a crack like thunder, sending candle flames guttering sideways and snuffing 3 of them entirely. A cold wind tore through the hall in one violent gust. And then every wolf in the room, every enforcer, every elder, every sneering face that had watched her walk to the center of the floor, dropped their head. Not one of them made the choice. Their bodies simply did it. Mara, still half kneeling, looked up. 3 miles from the border, his horse stopped, not slowed, not shied at a sound in the undergrowth. Stopped, all 4 legs locking simultaneously, the animal releasing a sharp, frightened sound and rearing back with enough force that Zayden had to grip hard with both knees to stay seated. His 2 lead guards pulled their horses to a halt behind him, hands moving to weapons out of reflex. "My king." He didn't hear the rest of it. Something had happened to his chest. That was the only way he could have described it in that moment. Something had happened there, in the space behind his sternum, like a hand reaching through bone and closing around whatever lived at his center. Not pain, older than pain. Chat a pull so specific and so violent that it briefly took the breath from his lungs and left him sitting motionless in the saddle while the night forest moved around him. He had felt nothing like it in 300 years. He had felt nothing like it since before he stopped counting years at all. "Continue north," he said. His voice came out steady. He had long ago perfected the art of steadiness regardless of what was happening beneath it. "I'll follow the road and meet you at the ridge by morning. Protocol requires—" "I'm aware of what protocol requires." He turned his horse toward the east, toward the pull, toward whatever was dragging at him like a hook through water. "Continue north." They obeyed, because they always obeyed, and he rode alone into the dark. He didn't question it. The 3 centuries of existence had taught him that there were forces older than reason and that arguing with them was a waste of the time you had left. The pull intensified the closer he got. Not painful, but urgent, the way a sound rises in volume as you approach its source. By the time he saw the lights of the pack hall through the trees, his chest felt close to splitting with it. He dismounted at the tree line and walked the rest of the way. The doors were closed. Through them, he could hear a man's voice, measured, deliberate, the cadence of someone performing authority for an audience. He recognized that cadence. He had been in enough rooms with enough men who mistook performance for power to know it on instinct. He opened the doors. He didn't intend for them to hit the walls the way they did. That was the energy coming off him. Yet the thing that happened when he moved with full intention in an enclosed space. It had been an inconvenience his entire adult life. The candles guttered. The cold came in. And 60 wolves dropped their heads before their minds had time to form a reason for it, their bodies obeying something instinctual and inarguable. Zayden stepped into the hall and let his eyes move across the room. He was looking for the source of the pull. He expected something dramatic, some obvious sign, some marking or emanation that would explain why he had left his route and ridden through dark forest like a man with no better sense. His eyes swept the bowed heads, the stone walls, the guttering lights, and stopped. Center of the floor. Half kneeling. A young woman with her head lifted just enough that he could see her face. Tear-streaked. Her jaw set with the particular determination of someone who is refusing to fully break even while breaking. Alone in the middle of 60 people. A broken mate mark at her throat like an old insult that had never fully healed. The pull in his chest became an anchor. Something rose in him that he did not immediately have a name for. It moved through him slowly and then all at once. Ancient, territorial, and furious in a way that had nothing to do with politics or protocol and everything to do with something far older than either. He had walked into rooms containing genuine threats without feeling a fraction of what he felt looking at the man standing over her. He found the alpha without needing to be told which one he was. The only wolf in the room who hadn't bowed, standing with his jaw tight and his pride doing battle with his instincts. And Zayden looked at him the way he looked at most things that required correction, directly, without particular emotion, with the full weight of what he was behind his eyes. Alpha Daemon. He said it quietly. He didn't need volume. You will kneel, now. Daemon's mouth opened, closed. The protest was there. Zayden could see it forming, the reflexive assertion of local authority, the pride of a man who had never once been told no by anyone in this territory. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Damon's knees hit the stone floor with a sound that carried to every corner of the silent hall, and the expression on his face was one Zayden had seen before on men who had just discovered the precise location of their own ceiling. Zayden didn't look at him again. He crossed the hall. The crowd parted without being asked. They were still bowed, but still silent, the kind of collective stillness that only happened in the presence of something that reminded wolves of what they actually were beneath the pack structures and the politics. He walked until he was standing in front of her. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected, and more composed than she had any right to be given what he'd walked in on. Her eyes were dry now, barely, by an act of will he recognized and respected. She was looking at him with wariness and exhaustion and something underneath both of those things that she had not yet decided to name. He extended his hand. "Stand up," he said, quietly, just for her. "You are not an Omega. You never were." She looked at his hand for a long moment. He waited. He would have waited considerably longer. Then she took it. The bond closed like a door that had been open for 3 centuries, finally finding its frame, complete, immediate, and absolute. He felt it move through him from the point of contact outward, settling into his bones like something that had always been there and was only now being recognized. From the slight catch in her breath, he understood she felt it too. Neither of them said anything about it. She rose to her feet, her hand still in his, and for the first time since he'd entered the hall, she stood at her full height. He kept his expression neutral for the benefit of the room, but he did not let go of her hand. He didn't explain himself in the hall. He simply turned to Damon, still kneeling, still wearing that stunned, humiliated expression like a man who had put on a coat and found it didn't fit anymore, and said, or with the same quiet finality he'd used for everything else, that Mara would be leaving with him tonight. Damon found his voice somewhere in the rubble of his pride. She is pack property. Under pack law, she is subject to... I know what pack law says. Zayden's tone didn't change. It didn't need to. I'm telling you what will happen. If you'd like to discuss the distinction, I have advisors who enjoy that kind of conversation. I don't. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man discovering that the room he thought he owned had always belonged to someone else. Damon said nothing more. His release of her wasn't gracious. It was the only option available to him, and everyone in the hall understood that, including him. Perhaps especially him. Mara was given 20 minutes to collect her things. She didn't need 20. And everything she owned fit into a canvas satchel. The herb journal, 2 changes of clothes, a small knife, and a handful of dried valerian she hadn't used. She was back at the door of the hall before anyone expected her, satchel over one shoulder, and if her hands weren't entirely steady, she kept them close enough to her sides that it didn't show. Zayden's horse had been brought around. 2 of his guards had appeared from somewhere. She hadn't seen them arrive, and they stood at a slight distance with the practiced neutrality of people trained to observe without reacting. Mara looked at the horses, at the dark road leading away from the only place she had ever lived, and felt the particular vertigo of a life changing faster than the mind can process it. You'll ride with me, Zayden said. Not a question. She nodded and didn't speak, as because she didn't trust what might come out if she opened her mouth. The road north was dark and cold and went on for a long time. Mara sat in front of him on the horse, rigidly upright, maintaining as much distance between her back and his chest as the saddle would allow. She watched the tree line and the stars, and the way the road unspooled ahead of them into nothing she recognized, and she waited for the moment when the terms of this arrangement would be explained to her. The moment when the kindness would show its underside, the way kindness always did eventually, in her experience. It didn't come in the first hour, or the second. He rode in silence. His guards flanked them at a respectful distance and spoke to each other in low voices she couldn't make out. Occasionally, Zayden would adjust the horse's direction with a slight shift of weight, and she would feel it through her spine and remind herself to stay upright. She caught him looking at her, not staring, nothing so obvious. But twice she turned her head slightly and found his gaze moving away from her face with the deliberate casualness of someone who had been watching for longer than they intended. She filed that away without knowing what to do with it. The temperature dropped sharply past midnight. The forest here was dense and old, the kind that held cold the way stone does, radiating it outward slowly, relentlessly. Mara had not brought a coat. She hadn't owned a proper one in 2 years, the last having worn through at the elbows and been repurposed for kitchen rags by someone who didn't ask her first. She tightened her jaw and breathed through her nose and focused very hard on not shivering visibly. She shivered anyway. He didn't say anything. There was no comment, no observation, no "are you cold" delivered in the tone of someone waiting to be thanked. He simply reached around her, unclasped the heavy cloak from his own shoulders in one movement, and settled it around hers. The warmth hit her like something physical. She looked down at the cloak in her lap, dark wool, heavy, lined with something soft, still carrying the heat of him. Her hands closed around the edges of it slowly, the way you handle something you're not sure you're allowed to keep. She had been handed things before, in her life. Chores, blame, the occasional bowl of food left over after everyone else had eaten. She could not recall the last time something had been placed around her shoulders without an agenda attached to it. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure the words were available to her in that moment. But she held the cloak close, and eventually, somewhere past the third hour of riding, her spine stopped being quite so rigid. She must have slept, because she woke to gray pre-dawn light and a different quality of cold, and the sound of the guards' voices becoming more frequent. She straightened quickly, aware of the awkward angle of her head and what that implied. "We'll stop here until full light," Zayden said, as though she hadn't just woken against his shoulder. "There's something you should know before we reach the court." She waited. "The Lycan court is old," he said. "Political. There are people there who have spent considerable time and effort arranging what they believe the future should look like." He paused. "You arriving without warning will complicate their arrangements." Mara looked at the road ahead, where the first pale light was beginning to separate the sky from the tree line. How complicated? Considerably. She thought about that. About walking into another hall full of people who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. About starting again in a new place where she was, once more, an inconvenience no one had asked for. "I've handled complicated before," she said quietly. He said nothing, but she had the distinct impression, from some shift in the air between them, that it was the right answer. And the court rose out of the morning mist like something that had always existed and simply waited for the world to grow up around it. Mara saw it from half a mile out and said nothing, because there were no words immediately available that wouldn't sound like what they were. The reaction of someone who had never seen anything larger than a pack hall in her life. Stone towers, dark with age, climbing above the tree line in a way that suggested they had been built by people with no interest in being modest about power. Walls that had clearly withstood things. Gates of iron that opened inward at the approach of Zayden's horse with a slowness that felt ceremonial, deliberate. The gates of a place that opened for very few and knew it. She kept her face neutral and her chin level and rode in beside him like she had done this before. What the courtyard was already populated despite the early hour, stable hands, guards in formation, attendants moving with the efficient quiet of people trained never to appear hurried. They all stilled when Zayden entered, and then, in the way of places built entirely on the reading of social cues, every eye in the courtyard found Mara. She felt the assessments land one by one. The torn hem of her dress, the canvas satchel, the broken mark at her throat, which she had stopped trying to hide somewhere around the third hour of riding because exhaustion had won out over self-consciousness. A woman near the far archway, noble-born, unmistakably, in the way that wealth makes itself visible without trying, let her gaze move from Mara's boots to her face, and then turned to the woman beside her and said something behind her hand. As Mara had spent years learning to read rooms, she read this one in under a minute. Inside was worse, in the particular way that beautiful things can be worse. The ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. The corridors hung with tapestries depicting Lycan history in gold and crimson thread. The floors worn smooth by centuries of feet that had all belonged to people more significant than her. Advisors materialized as though they had been waiting, because they had been, falling into step around Zayden with scrolls and questions, and the barely contained agitation of people whose carefully ordered world had just admitted an unpredicted variable. The eldest of them, a lean man with silver-streaked hair and the careful eyes of someone who had survived multiple political regimes, spoke first. "My king, what we weren't informed of a guest." The pause before the word was doing considerable work. "You're informed now," Zayden said without breaking stride. "Protocol would suggest she is under my protection." He said it the same way he said everything, quietly, without performance, with the absolute weight of someone who has never once needed to raise his voice to be believed. "Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. I won't repeat that." The advisor closed his mouth. The others exchanged glances that Mara catalogued carefully. not because she planned to act on them immediately, but because she had learned long ago that the looks people exchanged when they thought you weren't paying attention told you everything the words were hiding. She was given chambers on the eastern wing. Bet they were larger than the entire sleeping quarters of the pack hall. High windows overlooking a walled garden, a proper bed with linen she was almost afraid to touch, a fireplace already lit. A young woman was waiting inside when Mara entered, small and dark-haired with the kind of face that defaulted naturally to warmth. "My name is Senna," she said, without the wariness Mara expected. "I've been assigned to you. There are clothes in the chest. I didn't know your size, so I guessed from what the king described, which was not very detailed. But I think we're close." She paused. "Are you hungry? You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." Mara blinked. "I haven't." "Right. I'll have something sent up. The court kitchens are very good, which is one of the few genuinely nice things about this place." She said it with the easy candor of someone who had been here long enough to have opinions. Then she looked at Mara directly, without the evaluation she'd felt from everyone else. Just simple, uncomplicated attention. "Are you all right?" The question was so ordinary and so sincerely meant that Mara had to look away for a moment. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." Senna nodded like she understood more than what had been said, and went to arrange the food, and Mara stood alone in the center of the large room and breathed. She held herself together through dinner. Through Senna's quietly cheerful commentary on court life, through the process of washing and changing into clothes that fit properly and were not mended at the seams, it's through the fire burning warm and the bed waiting and every small comfort that kept arriving without being asked for. She held herself together through all of it. She made it until Senna said goodnight and closed the door. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and cried, not from sadness, not precisely. She didn't have a clean word for what it was. Something closer to the feeling of a muscle that has been clenched for so long that the moment it's allowed to release the pain arrives all at once, sharp and clarifying and almost indistinguishable from relief. She did not know how to exist in a place where someone defended her without being asked. She did not know the shape of it, the etiquette of it, where to put her hands. She would have to learn. Down the corridor, in a wing she had not yet seen, is the eldest court advisor, the silver-haired man who had questioned Zayden at the entrance, stood before a locked cabinet that contained, among other things, a document nearly 2 centuries old. He had retrieved it within an hour of seeing her. He stood reading it now for the 3rd time, tracing one particular line with his finger. "The king's true mate will carry no packmark that holds. Born of old blood, sealed by elder hand, she will appear as the least of wolves until the bond finds her." He closed the cabinet, locked it again. He looked at the wall for a long moment, thinking about timing and consequence, and the particular danger of prophecy arriving before anyone was prepared for it. Then he went to bed and said nothing to anyone. Seraphine found her on the 3rd day. Amara was in the eastern corridor returning from the library. Senna had shown her where it was, and she had been spending her mornings there, quietly and gratefully, reading anything that would help her understand the world she had walked into, when the woman appeared at the far end of the hall, as though she had been placed there deliberately, which Mara suspected she had. She was striking in the way that certain people are striking, not just beautiful but constructed, every element of her appearance arranged with the precision of someone who understood that presentation was its own form of power. Dark hair pinned at the neck, court colors worn with the ease of someone who had never dressed any other way. She smiled when she saw Mara, warm and immediate, and then crossed the corridor with her hands extended like they were old friends reuniting. "You must be Mara," she said. "I've been meaning to introduce myself. I'm Seraphine. I've been at court for, goodness, nearly 4 years now. It can be so overwhelming at first. I remember feeling completely lost." She laughed softly, the laugh of someone who had never been lost a day in her life. "I hope you're settling in." "I am," Mara said. "Thank you." Seraphine fell into step beside her without being invited. She talked easily about the court, about the rhythms of the place, about which advisors were worth speaking to, and which ones smiled at your face and worked against you the moment you turned around. It was useful information delivered in a warm tone, and Mara listened and did not fully relax, and hated that she couldn't. Because it would have been very easy to be grateful for the company. They paused at a window overlooking the main courtyard. Below, Zayden was crossing toward the stables with two of his guards, not looking up, moving with his usual contained purpose. Seraphine watched him with an expression that was almost tender. "He's remarkable, isn't he?" she said. Not quite a question. 300 years, and he still carries everything alone. It's one of the things I've always... She stopped herself with a small, practiced smile. "Forgive me. That's not my story to tell." Mara said nothing. Seraphine turned to look at her then, and something in the warmth shifted. Only slightly, only for a moment. Like light changing behind glass. "Can I give you a piece of advice, woman to woman, genuinely?" "Go ahead." "Zayden has a generous nature. People don't always see it because he's so controlled, but when he encounters something wounded, he has an instinct to intervene. It's admirable, really." She paused, letting the shape of the words settle. "He's brought people to court before. Strays, I suppose you'd call them. People who needed extracting from difficult situations. He takes care of them for a while, and then the court absorbs them and life continues." Another pause. Surgical. "I just wouldn't want you to confuse rescue for something else. It could lead to a great deal of unnecessary pain." She touched Mara's arm briefly, with every appearance of kindness, and excused herself down the corridor. Mara stood at the window for a while after she'd gone. Below, the courtyard was empty now. And she looked at the place where Zayden had been and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not because the words were new, exactly, but because they fit so neatly into the shape of everything she already feared that they required very little effort to believe. She was a stray. That was a reasonable reading of events. She had been extracted from a difficult situation by a powerful man with the means to do so. She had been given a room and clothes and protection. These were the actions of someone with resources and a conscience. They were not necessarily anything more than that. She had the wall back up by dinner. Zayden noticed at dinner. She saw him notice. A slight adjustment of attention, his eyes moving to her face twice in the space of a few minutes with the focused quality of someone recalibrating. She kept her own eyes on her plate and contributed nothing to the table conversation and told herself this was simpler. Simpler was better. Simpler was how you stayed intact. He found her that night on the ramparts. She had gone up because the room felt close and sleep wasn't coming, and the night air was sharp enough to be clarifying. She was leaning on the stone parapet looking out at the dark landscape when she heard his footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, and didn't turn around. He stood beside her for a moment, without speaking. The wind moved between them. "What changed?" he said, not accusatory, just direct, the way he was direct about everything. She considered deflecting. It would have been easy, she had years of practice, but she was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. And something about the night and the height and the cold made pretense feel like more effort than honesty. She told him what Seraphine had said, plainly, without editorializing, just the words and the shape of them. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply not respond. The wind came up again, moving across the stone. "I have not looked at another woman in 300 years, he said finally. His voice was low and even and carried the particular weight of things that are true and not often said out loud. "I don't know what you are to me yet. I won't tell you something I can't finish, but I know that you are not nothing, and I know that whatever brought me off that road and through those doors was not pity." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the dark horizon, the same as her. It wasn't a declaration. And it didn't resolve anything or answer the questions that lived underneath her ribs. but it was the most unguarded thing she had heard from another person in longer than she could accurately remember, and it landed somewhere beneath the wall rather than against it. She didn't respond, but she didn't move away either. They stood there together in the cold for a long time, looking out at the same darkness, and the space between them was slightly smaller than it had been before. The elder sent for her on a Tuesday morning, which Senna said was unusual because he never sent for anyone. People were summoned to him only when he decided the timing was right, and his sense of timing operated on a scale that had very little to do with anyone else's urgency. His name was Aldrich. She had seen him twice in passing since arriving at court, silver-haired, unhurried, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm so much as from having outlived most things worth being agitated about. He had looked at her both times with an expression she hadn't been able to read and had filed away without resolution. His study was at the top of the oldest tower, up a staircase that wound so tightly it felt like the building was trying to discourage visitors. Inside, it smelled of old paper and something mineral she couldn't name. He was seated when she entered and gestured to the chair across from him without preamble. He looked at her for a long moment after she sat. The kind of look that isn't rude so much as genuinely investigative, like he was confirming something he'd already suspected. You've spent your entire life being told what you are, he said. I imagine one more person telling you something about yourself is not immediately welcome. That depends on what they're telling me, Mara said. Something moved in his expression. Approval, perhaps. Fair enough. He folded his hands on the desk. You are not an Omega. You were never an Omega. What you are, what you were born as, is something this court believed extinct for over a century. He told her about the Valdris line, ancient Lycan bloodline, predating the current court structures by several generations, carrying a power that was neither wolf nor Lycan in the conventional sense, but something older than both. A force that the earliest records described only obliquely, in the way people write about things they don't fully understand, but deeply respect. The last Valdris had died, or so everyone believed, nearly 120 years ago. Mara's mother had not died without leaving things behind. The seal was placed at your birth, Aldrich said, by an elder who understood what would happen to a child carrying that bloodline if the wrong people learned she existed. People have been killed for less than what you carry. The seal compressed everything, your power, your rank signature, the markers that would have identified you, into something that read as the lowest possible classification. He paused. It was an act of protection. It was also, I imagine, an extraordinary burden. Mara sat very still. She was thinking about her mother's journal, about a woman who wrote careful notes on yarrow and elderflower and tucked a lifetime of knowledge into a cracked spine for a daughter she was already afraid she wouldn't be there to explain things to. About you were made for open sky said, like prophecy. She had known something. She had always known something. The seal, Mara said carefully, you said was. It has been weakening since the king found you. Aldrich's voice was even. He is the only living Lycan whose bloodline carries enough of the old force to act as a counterweight to the seal's construction. His proximity has been dissolving it gradually since the night in the hall. He looked at her with the directness of someone delivering information that cannot be softened by delivery. I don't know how much longer it will hold. She walked back to her chambers slowly, through corridors that looked the same as they had that morning and felt entirely different. She pressed her hand flat against the stone wall at one point and stood there for a moment, feeling the solidity of it, anchoring herself to something external, because the internal landscape had shifted so completely she needed a reference point. She was not what they had told her she was. She had never been what they told her she was. She didn't make it to sleep. Just past midnight she was still awake when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the quality of the air, the way the corridors of the castle seemed to hold a breath. Then a shout cut short from the direction of Zayden's wing. She was moving before she decided to move. The door to his outer chamber was open at a wrong angle. Inside, 3 figures, cloaked, armed, and moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had planned this carefully. Zayden was engaged with 2 of them, controlled and lethal and bleeding from a cut above his temple, but the third was circling to his blind side with something in his hand that caught the lamplight in a way that made her chest seize. "Hey." Her voice came out strange, lower than usual, resonant in a way she didn't recognize. The third figure turned. She didn't know what she did. She had no framework for it, no language, no prior experience to reach for. What she knew was that something released inside her, the way a dam doesn't leak but fails, completely and all at once, and the world went silver. Not metaphorically. The room went silver. Light that came from her and had no external source, ancient and cold and vast, irradiating outward from her center with a force that hit the walls and the ceiling and the 3 figures simultaneously. The cloaked men were thrown back, not violently, but absolutely, like the room had simply decided they didn't belong in it. The lamps extinguished. The silver light held for 3 long seconds and then contracted back into her like a tide. The silence afterward was total. Mara stood in the center of the room breathing hard, her hands open at her sides, staring at the 3 unconscious figures on the floor. She could feel the power settling back into her like something finally coming home after a very long time away. She looked up. Zayden stood across the room. The cut at his temple was still bleeding, slow and ignored. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not shock exactly. Because shock implied he was entirely unprepared, and she suspected he was rarely entirely unprepared. Something more like recognition. Arriving at a conclusion he had been approaching for weeks, and finding it more complete than even he had anticipated. He had known she was his mate since the night he crossed that hall. That had been its own certainty, settled and absolute. But this was something additional, the understanding that he had not extended his hand to someone who needed lifting. He had extended his hand to someone who had been standing at his level the entire time, compressed into a shape too small for her by people who needed her to be manageable. She had never been beneath him. She had always been his equal. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The silver had faded from the room, but something of it remained. In the air. Yet in the charged quiet between them, in the way they were looking at each other across the smoke and the stillness. "Are you hurt?" she asked finally, because it was the most immediate thing and she needed to say something ordinary. He touched the cut at his temple almost absently, like he'd forgotten it was there. "No," she nodded. Her hands were still trembling faintly, and she suspected they would for a while yet. He crossed the room and she didn't move back, and he stopped close enough that she could see his expression clearly, all of it, without the careful control he usually kept drawn across his face like a curtain. What was underneath was not small. "I know what you are now," he said quietly. "So do I," she said, finally. He arrived on a Thursday, day which Senna reported with the particular tone of someone delivering news they know will require a response. Mara was in the library when she heard. She set down the book she was holding, took one measured breath, and said, "When did he get here?" "An hour ago. He's requested a formal court audience." Senna paused. "He came with 4 of his enforcers and a written petition. He's calling it a diplomatic visit." Mara nodded slowly. She looked at the page she'd been reading without seeing it, then closed the book and stood. She had known, in the abstract, that this was coming. Men like Damon didn't absorb humiliation quietly. They metabolized it into action, into the need to reassert and reclaim and restore the version of the world in which they were still the largest thing in the room. And she had been the instrument of his embarrassment simply by being taken seriously by someone he couldn't override. That was not something he would leave unaddressed. She went to her chambers and she dressed carefully. Not with vanity, but with intention, the way you prepare for something that requires your full self present. The court colors Senna had chosen for her weeks ago, Deep blue-gray, clean lines, nothing borrowed or approximate. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at her own reflection for a long moment. The broken mate mark was still visible at her throat. She had started, recently, to think of it differently, not as a brand of worthlessness, but as a record. Evidence of something survived. She left it visible and went downstairs. The court was already assembled when she reached the entrance to the main hall. The word had moved quickly, as it always did in places built on information and hierarchy. She could feel the collective attention of the room recalibrate the moment she appeared in the doorway. A subtle shift, bodies turning slightly, the particular alertness of people who understand they are about to witness something significant. Damon was at the center of the floor. The geometry of it was not lost on her. He had dressed carefully, too, pack formal, every enforcer sigil polished, the physical authority of his frame deployed to its fullest effect. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had walked into a room expecting it to work the way rooms had always worked for him. He saw her, and something moved across his face. Recalculation. She was not what he had prepared for. She understood that. Though she had not been what she was prepared for either, until recently. The senior advisor opened the session with the formal language of court proceedings, and Damon made his case. She gave him the courtesy of listening to the whole thing without interrupting. He was composed and articulate and thorough. She had always known he was not stupid, only cruel, and stupidity and cruelty were not the same deficiency. He spoke about pack law, jurisdictional authority, the danger of allowing omegas to operate outside established structures. He used the word unstable twice. He described her actions with Eli as evidence of compromised judgment that posed a risk to border security. He was persuasive in the way that people are persuasive when they have been telling a particular story for so long they have stopped being able to distinguish it from truth. The court listened. Faces were careful and unreadable in the way of people who have learned to withhold reaction until they understand which direction the wind is moving. Zayden sat at the head of the room and said nothing. When Damon finished, the silence held for a moment. Then Mara stepped forward. She didn't ask for the floor. She simply took it, the way you occupy space that was always yours and simply wasn't labeled yet. She spoke without notes and without heat. Her voice was even, not the evenness of someone suppressing emotion, but the deeper evenness of someone who has moved through the emotion and come out the other side into something clearer. She began with facts, dates, specifics, the precise sequence of events that Damon's account had carefully arranged to omit. The nature of Eli's wound, the timeline that proved he had been no threat to the pack border, the pack law clause he had failed to cite that distinguished between rogue wolves fleeing violence and rogue wolves posing active danger. She was meticulous, and she was accurate, and she cited 3 separate precedents from Lycan territorial law that she had spent the last 2 weeks reading in the library for reasons she had not fully articulated to herself until this moment. Then she moved to the rest of it. She did not perform outrage. She did not make it personal in the way that would have made it easy to dismiss. She simply described, with the same measured clarity, the conditions under which she had lived in that pack. The systematic diminishment, the manufactured helplessness, the way pack law had been applied selectively to maintain a social order that served one person's authority above all others. She described the night of the gathering not as her story, but as a data point in a longer pattern, and she named the pattern for what it was, and she let the room draw its own conclusions. She watched understanding settle across the court like weather moving in. Damon tried once, toward the end, to reassert. He straightened to his full height and let the alpha force of his presence push outward the way he always had. The thing that made wolves step back, look down, reconsider. Mara felt it arrive and felt, with a clarity that was almost startling, that it meant nothing to her anymore. Her power was awake and settled in her bones, and what Damon was projecting was simply not large enough to reach her now. Yet she held his gaze. He looked away first, Then he looked back, tried again, and looked away a second time. Something involuntary. Something his body did without consulting his pride. She saw the moment he understood it, saw it move through him like cold water. He was a small man in a very large room, and the room had noticed. The court's decision was not delivered dramatically. It rarely was in places where power was exercised with confidence rather than performance. The senior advisor simply informed Damon that his petition had been heard and considered, and that the court found no legal basis for the claims presented. He was thanked for making the journey. The audience was closed. Damon stood for a moment in the center of the floor. He looked at Mara once more. Not with the calculating assessment he'd arrived with, but with something rawer underneath it, something she recognized as the specific anger of a person confronting the gap between who they believed themselves to be and who they actually were. She met it without flinching and without satisfaction. She felt neither of those things. What she felt was quieter and more complete. The particular stillness of something finished. He turned and walked toward the doors. His 4 enforcers fell in behind him. No one in the court spoke until the doors had closed, and then the room exhaled collectively, and the sound of it was almost like approval. Zayden had not said a single word throughout the entire proceeding. He didn't need to. That had always been the point. Mara stood in the center of the floor. The same floor. Yet a different woman. And for the first time in her life, the room felt appropriately sized. The formal recognition happened 4 days after Damon left. Aldrich presented the documentation to the full court, the Valdris lineage records, the elder's seal notation from the night of her birth, the prophecy in its original language alongside the translation that had been sitting locked in his cabinet since the night she arrived. He read it aloud in the particular unhurried cadence of someone who understands that certain moments should not be rushed, and the court listened with the quality of attention that only appears when people understand they are present for something that will be recounted later. Mara stood at the front of the room and let it happen. She had learned, in the weeks since arriving, the difference between things happening to her and things happening for her, and she was still learning to recognize which was which in real time, but this felt like the latter. The title they offered her was old, older than the current court structure, predating several of the noble lines represented in the room. And it settled onto her with the particular weight of things that were always meant to be there. Seraphine was present. She stood near the back with her expression arranged into something gracious, and her eyes doing something else entirely. Mara looked at her once, without malice, and looked away. She had spent no further thought on Seraphine after the ramparts, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of the understanding that small cruelties only retained their power if you kept returning to them. Yet the court reception afterward was long and full of people whose names she was still learning, and who now looked at her with an attention that was different in quality from what she'd received upon arrival. She moved through it with Senna at her elbow, providing quiet commentary, and managed to feel, for the first time, something approaching at ease. Zayden was there, but not beside her. He moved through the room as he always did, contained, deliberate, present without performing it. And she was aware of him the way she had become aware of him over the past weeks, with a peripheral attentiveness that she had stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. He found her that evening, not in the great hall or the library, or any of the rooms where the court conducted its life. He came to the walled garden beneath her window, as where she had taken to sitting in the late afternoons when the light came through at an angle that reminded her, in a way she couldn't fully explain, of the edge of the eastern woods at home. She heard the gate and looked up, and he came and sat beside her on the stone bench without ceremony or preamble, which was consistent with everything she had come to understand about how he operated. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone gathering courage. He didn't seem to require courage for honesty in the way that most people did, but the silence of someone choosing their words with care because they mean them. "The bond is real," he said. "I want you to know that I know that. Yet I knew it the moment I crossed that hall, before I knew anything about your bloodline or the prophecy or any of the things Aldrich has since explained to me at considerable length. Something moved briefly in his expression. I want to be clear that none of those things are why I'm here. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden, at the last of the evening light on the stone walls. Every step I've taken since that night has been toward you, he said. Not toward the Valdres line, or the fulfilled prophecy, or what it means for the court. Toward you specifically. The version of you that existed before anyone confirmed what you were. That is the version I came off that road for. He turned to look at her then, directly, with the full weight of 300 years of careful self-containment set deliberately aside. But you have spent your entire life having choices made for you. I will not be another person who does that. This one is yours. Completely and without any pressure from me in either direction. I mean that. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, a nightbird started and stopped. Mara looked at her own hands in her lap. She thought about the girl who had woken before dawn to have 1 hour of silence that belonged to her. The girl who had eaten standing up because sitting felt too much like settling. The girl who had learned to want nothing because wanting things was a form of vulnerability she couldn't afford. She had spent so long in survival mode that desire had become a foreign language. She understood its shape, but had lost the ability to speak it fluently. The past weeks had been, among other things, a slow relearning. How to accept warmth without waiting for it to be taken back. How to occupy space without apologizing for it. How to let herself notice what she wanted and not immediately dismantle the noticing. She knew what she wanted. She had known for a while. I spent so long just trying to stay intact, she said quietly, that I forgot I was allowed to want something beyond that. She looked up at him. I want this. Not because of what I am, or what the prophecy says, or because I have nowhere else to go. I have somewhere to go now, I understand that. I want this because it's you. She paused. I choose you. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic man, but in the way of something that has been held under considerable tension for a long time finally being released. He reached across the space between them, and his hand found hers in the way it had once before, in a very different room under very different circumstances, and the bond responded the way it always did. Immediate, complete, the deep recognition of something that had been true before either of them could name it. They completed the bond as the last light left the garden, not with ceremony or witnesses or the formal structure the court would have arranged if given the opportunity. Just the two of them in the quiet, and the ancient thing between them finally allowed to close properly, like a sentence finding its last word. She woke before dawn. The habit was so old it lived in her body independent of circumstance, pulling her up out of sleep in the dark hours before the world had fully committed to the day. For a moment, met in the way of half-sleep, she reached for the familiar weight of it. The cold, the narrow mat, the particular silence of a place where no one was waiting for her to appear. Then she felt the warmth at her back, the weight of a different room, the high ceiling just visible in the dark, the windows showing the walled garden below, the quality of quiet that belongs to a place where she was not merely tolerated but wanted. She lay still for a moment and let the morning arrive around her. Somewhere below, the court was beginning its day. There would be things required of her, meetings, decisions, the long and complicated work of stepping into a life she was still learning the dimensions of. There would be people to navigate, and history to understand, and a title to grow into with some semblance of grace. There would be Senna with commentary and Aldrich with documents, and a version of herself she was only beginning to recognize in the mirror. The world was waiting for her. She found, lying in the gray pre-dawn with the bond settled warm in her chest and the garden quiet below the window, that she was not afraid of that. She rose to meet it. She had been right about one thing in those early weeks at court. It was complicated. The months that followed were not simple or seamless, or delivered with the neat resolution of things that only happen in stories. There were court factions that required patience she had to consciously choose every morning. There were noble families who accepted her bloodline confirmation on paper and communicated their reservations through every other available channel. And there were days when the weight of becoming something new sat heavily on top of the bones of everything she used to be, and she had to remind herself that transformation was not an event, but a practice, something you return to repeatedly, imperfectly, without the option of being finished with it. Seraphine requested a transfer to the Northern Court 3 weeks after the formal recognition. Mara signed the approval herself, with a clean signature and no commentary, and considered the matter settled. Aldrich became something close to a mentor, not warm exactly, but consistently present, and in her experience, consistency was worth more than warmth when warmth was unreliable. He taught her the history of the Valdres line over long Tuesday mornings in his tower study, and she taught him, without intending to, that the person a prophecy describes is always more complicated and more interesting than what the prophecy says about them. Senna stayed. Of course she stayed. She had opinions about everything, and was right often enough that Mara had stopped being surprised by it. Eli found her, eventually. A letter arrived from the settlement she had pointed him toward that morning in the woods. Careful handwriting, brief, asking if the rumors reaching even their quiet corner of the territory were true. She wrote back and confirmed them, and told him she still had the memory of what he'd said to her in the thin morning light, and that it had mattered more than he knew at a moment when very little else had. He wrote again, they kept writing, she was glad of it. Damon's pack lost 3 families to voluntary relocation in the months following his return from court. Word traveled, as it always did. The story of what had happened in that hall, both halls, the pack hall and the court, moved through the territory in the way that true things move, gathering detail and losing nothing essential. She heard, through the channels that brought her information now, that he had become quieter, more careful. Whether that constituted change or merely adjustment she couldn't say and didn't spend time trying to determine. Her mother's journal she kept on the desk in her study, not tucked away. Open sometimes to no particular page, just present, the way certain things need to be present even when you're not actively looking at them. She and Zayden did not become simple with each other. Bet she suspected they never would, and suspected further that this was not a problem but a feature. 2 people with considerable histories and strong instincts occupying the same life required ongoing negotiation, and they were both, it turned out, better at honesty than at ease. They argued sometimes, with the frankness of people who have both spent too long being careful with words to waste them on performance. They found their way back to each other every time, not despite the arguing but partially because of it, because repair was its own kind of intimacy when done without pride getting in the way. She stood on the ramparts sometimes in the early evenings, the same ramparts where he had told her she was not nothing, where the wall had first cracked, and looked out at the territory that was hers now as much as anyone's, and felt the power settled in her chest like a tide that had finally found its shore. She thought about the girl who had eaten standing up, who had wrapped herself in borrowed silence before dawn and called it freedom, who had lowered herself toward a cold stone floor while 60 people looked away. She did not think of her with pity. She thought of her with the specific tenderness you extend to someone who carried something very heavy for a very long time and did not drop it, who kept walking, kept choosing the difficult right thing over the survivable wrong one, kept some stubborn, unkillable part of herself intact through years of being told there was nothing there worth keeping. That girl had brought her here. She owed her everything. "You were made for open sky," her mother had said. She looked up. But the sky above the court was wide and darkening toward evening, the first stars arriving at the edges. She breathed it in, the cold, the height, the vast uncomplicated fact of a world that had been there all along, waiting for her to take up her full space in it. Behind her she heard footsteps she recognized without turning. Zayden came to stand beside her. He didn't speak. He looked out at the same sky with the expression he wore when he was simply present rather than managing anything, which she had come to understand was the rarest and most valuable version of him. After a while, she leaned into his side. He put his arm around her without comment, the way you do something that requires no explanation. They stood there as the dark came in, and the stars multiplied, and the court below them continued its life, and she was completely, but finally, without qualification or condition, exactly where she was meant to be. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in Mara felt familiar, I want you to know that's not an accident. The best stories find the people who need them. If you're still here, you're exactly the kind of reader this channel exists for. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. New chapters, new worlds, new characters who refuse to stay on their knees. Every week, right here. Hit the notification bell, leave a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story about a woman who was never what they told her she was, share this with them. And I will see you in my next story.